Hello, everyone. Good day, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to our month's episode of Conversations in Planetary Health. I'm Dr. Renzo Guinto, Associate Professor of Planetary Health, the lead of the Planetary Health Initiative here at the SingHealth Duke-NUS Global Health Institute in Singapore. Again, thank you very much for joining us, to our audience who are in the room, but also to our online participants. And we look forward to an engaging, exciting, thought-provoking conversation on the topic that we're going to talk about in a short while. As you know, we in SDGHI do have a planetary health initiative. We do projects tackling various topics, various issues at the nexus of human health and the environment, from climate change to all types of pollution and how human health is being affected by these many different issues. And we always emphasize the need for a transdisciplinary approach. We're in a medical school. We're attached to SingHealth, which is the largest healthcare cluster in Singapore. But we also try and be intentional. We try to be intentional in working with colleagues from different disciplines, the social sciences, engineering, climate sciences, and now we are going to listen to and have a conversation with a lawyer. So without further ado, let me just introduce briefly our guest who came all the way from the Netherlands. She is an associate professor of international law at the Faculty of Law of the University in Groningen in the Netherlands. Also the chair of the Groningen Center for Health Law. She has been working at the nexus of law and the health of the planet as well for several years now. And we really look forward to learning from her and listening to her about her work, her views, her insights, and basically to answer the question for this episode: what is the potential power of the law to advance planetary health? So, without further ado, let's listen to a presentation first from our guest, to be followed by a conversation. So please prepare your questions both to our in-person participants and also to those on Zoom. Let's give a warm welcome, a big hand to Professor Marlies Hesselman. Welcome.
Thank you, Renzo, and thanks so much to you and to your team for having me here at your institute. You've already mentioned I'm a lawyer by background, or a legal scholar, and I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to say a bit about what it is that I do in this sphere and some of the questions that lawyers are trying to figure out in this space. And I fully support this idea of the need for interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary cooperation. So I also look forward to your challenging and no doubt thought-provoking questions at the end. But first, allow me to, let's say, introduce a little bit what has been happening in this sphere from a legal perspective, mostly from an international law perspective, and to maybe talk to you mostly about what might be the power of international law on, let's say, one of the highest levels of legal regulation that we can have for planetary health, whereby there is already a lot of law adopted. International environmental law is relevant to this area. There is the area of global health law, which is relevant to this area, human rights. But the question that I also want to put on the table a bit today is this enough, right? Do we need more to really address these systemic issues of planetary health law, whereby it's really also trying to understand our position of you as humans within the wider environment, right? And our interactions with the environment. And does the current legal system already recognize that sufficiently? That's the question. The one thing that I will talk then about as well is this emerging notion of planetary health law as a way of maybe trying to provide the first building blocks for this. There are a few people working on this concept at the moment. And then I also want to say a little bit about what's the power of the law in practice, right? Because we can think about great concepts and see how we can think about this. But of course, we want law to do things in practice as well. Then I will look a little bit with you at some current or expected developments, specifically the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice that's being anticipated for next week. I fully understand that it's likely that I'll be talking mostly to a non-legal audience. So if at any point something is not clear, feel free to ask, and I'll try to keep this in mind as I present. So maybe with that in mind, let me actually start with this nice infographic, which shows that actually the environment has been protected through law already since a long time, but so far still somewhat in a fragmented way. So we say that international environmental law in particular has been developing since the 1970s, when we became aware in the 1960s for the first time of some of these major environmental impacts, impacting not just single countries, but really, being confronted as internationally global problems. And we see then that some of the first treaties that were being adopted in this area related to natural protection mostly, right? So protection of wetlands, protection of natural heritage, but also fauna, endangered species. After that, we turned a little bit more to pollutive substances, so pollution at sea, long-range transboundary air pollution. In the 1980s, the very serious issue of the ozone layer being depleted, ozone depletion being also currently one of the planetary boundaries that we are concerned about. Except that we are not concerned about this particular boundary so much anymore, because precisely it was quite successfully regulated in the 1980s. And then later in the 1990s, we see attention to these more systemic issues, right? So climate change as a big issue to be regulated, protection of biodiversity, much more complex environmental processes that states really try to address together. We also see some other innovations there. In the 1990s, late 1990s, we see a convention that really tries to also bring in individuals in this fight for environmental protection through procedural rights. So the public's access to information, participation, and access to justice in environmental matters, really as a way of actually really also involving not just states, but the public in making environmental protection happen, and to make sure that people have a say and can also supervise what states are doing in this area. So there is actually already a lot, but the question is it enough? And states have agreed in some ways that no, this current system is not yet enough. And in this sense, we've seen some new treaties being adopted recently, after a period of having relatively little activity in this area of law. We first see that in 2023 there was a new, unique treaty adopted that is really about regulating the oceans. It's called the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Agreement, also known as the Oceans Treaty. And in one way, it is, it's unique, but it's also a bit shocking that this Oceans Treaty came only so late, because that means that up until this point in time, the oceans, which are of course, the large part of our planet, they were simply largely unregulated. They were covered by principles of what we call the high seas, where simply it is possible to freely fish, to freely navigate, without too much protection, except maybe perhaps for some specific issues or specific species such as whales. And the idea of this new agreement is that hopefully it will help to support putting at least 30% of the oceans under some type of conservation regime by 2030. That's quite ambitious, but it really shows that the environmental law is still responding. We may wonder whether the new global pandemic agreement is also part of international environmental law, or is that mostly to be viewed as more classical global health law, right? Is the pandemic treaty mostly about treating disease, or is it also about these planetary health questions? And I would argue it's, of course, the latter. And the interesting thing is that this new treaty, the pandemic treaty, also very much refers to the environment, especially through the concept of One Health. So we see here that the ideas of planetary health are really entering into legal frameworks as well. And then I want to mention this third recent innovation and development, where I think we really are hopefully starting to see this integration of health law, environmental health law, in recognition of having to tackle another very serious problem, which is the global plastic pollution. And this treaty, a new treaty and agreement, has been under negotiation already since a few years. There is now an expectation that it might be concluded at the end of this year, but it has been a hard negotiation. This treaty is really about trying to address plastics throughout the entire life cycle. And there is still debate. That's part of one of the sticky issues is whether or not there should be a specific provision, the standalone provision on health there as well, to really integrate the idea of health in this treaty as well. Hopefully with a reference to the concept of the right to health, but let's see what will happen there. The interesting thing is that all these treaties in their own way are indeed about health, human health. But I think what is really the idea of planetary health law, and what I might also call here planetary health crisis law, is that the idea of thinking about the interaction of all these fields together is that planetary health law can really help us to, let's say, address these serious planetary boundaries that are at risk. And for me, this is also what this concept of planetary health crisis law represents, not just planetary health law, because planetary health law might in some ways still sound somewhat neutral. It's maybe about studying how health indeed is helping to regulate the planet's health and the ecosystems. But I think by introducing this concept of crisis there, potentially, we also show the urgency of it. And maybe with that also the urgency of having sufficient legal innovation. So I think that is also something that I want to put on the table within this wider discussion of planetary health that has been emerging. And it's also being very much led by scholars in Asia. There's here a definition from Eric Ip, who is a professor in Hong Kong University, who has really put this notion on the agenda. And there's now an attempt to really try to flesh out this field. And the understanding is that this idea of using law to regulate planetary health can already make use of existing building blocks, informed by this vision that humankind is really part of nature and that we should move towards more non-anthropocentric fields of the law by combining all these fields that I've just discussed, environmental law, global health law, relevant human rights, such as the right to health, the right to healthy environment. But Eric Ip has also, for example, rightly identified that it should not just be about rights of humans in that case, but that we should try to find a way to understand human rights alongside rights of nature, also valuing the intrinsic nature for nature itself, but also valuing a nature for the contributions that it makes to humankind, right? The question then is, like I said, is all of this enough, right? It's already quite novel to try to want to incorporate these existing areas into something bigger. But we are also seeing that law is responding with new concepts. People are working on the idea of ecocide to suggest, large-scale destruction of the environment in such an irresponsible and intentional way that it could even become an international crime, and that people could at one point be held responsible for that. So that also might bring in the field of criminal law into the area of public health, planetary health law. We've seen, of course, a lot of inspiration from One Health, and there's also talk of One Health law. Like I said, the pandemic treaty very much now includes this concept, which I think is a very important innovation. And there's also new human rights again emerging, such as the idea that we have a right to a stable climate, whatever that means. Right? So I think it's about trying to map out this field and to really try to think through also a bit conceptually what law contributes, but also how current law is falling short and what type of legal innovations are needed with what type of implications. The question is then indeed, and I've already mentioned it briefly, what would be the benefit of speaking about planetary health crisis law, right, rather than just planetary health law? For me, I would say, or I would hope that this concept of crisis law might lead us to indeed more out-of-the-box, innovative legal approaches. Often when we adopt crisis laws in response to other situations, such as the pandemic, for example, we see that we are suddenly finding extraordinary solutions that we didn't think possible before. So I think that this concept maybe could also help us inspire thinking in this wider area. What type of legal responses do we need that we didn't think of before? And maybe also bringing in a lesson from the pandemic, not just acting in a reactive way with law, but also in a proactive way. So thinking ahead with some imaginaries. What are these planetary boundaries that are being transgressed, and what is really needed from a legal perspective to make sure that we move back or come back? And I've already briefly referred to that, but for example, one of these planetary boundaries when it comes to ocean depletion, it has been quite successfully tackled. And it is also still being monitored because there might be new ozone depleting substances that we are concerned about, and then there is also room for adaptation. But the adaptation possibility was built into the legal system when it was adopted. So I think adaptation is also this very important value. Moving a bit to what I said, what's happening then in practice, right? Because this is also the more conceptual dimension, although it is grounded in very much existing fields of law that are trying to regulate in favor of the planet. But we see legal innovations occurring as well, especially with bold courts taking up certain challenges, specifically in the context of the climate crisis. And even though my audience is not from the area of law, you may have actually heard or seen about this particular advisory opinion of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, adopted last week. It made a lot of headlines because it tried to clarify for the first time as an international court what states' obligations are to address the climate crisis from a perspective of human rights. And it is quite a unique advisory opinion because, as I will explain at the end, it will be the first of a range to come shortly, but also on a longer term. So what this court adds to the debate is, of course, important. It sets an important precedent. And luckily, we get an opinion from a court that has been willing to innovate generally and is also making bold moves at this point. So first of all, this court recognized or endorsed specifically that, yes, people globally are facing triple planetary health crisis. It's not just climate change, but it's climate change and biodiversity and environmental pollution. And it threatens this on a global scale. And the court was struggling a little bit with this because it said, I'm being asked to decide on climate change, but I'm very well aware that I cannot see climate change as separate from these issues, right? So I'm going to pronounce on climate change, but keep all these other things into account as well. And in this context, give an interpretation of what people's rights to a healthy environment would mean. And in that sense, it introduced a new right under the American Convention on Human Rights, which is indeed this evaluation into a right to a healthy and stable climate that people can also claim. The court also recognized or endorsed, because it had said it before, that indeed in the American human rights context, it is also appropriate to speak of the rights of nature, right? So there are certain elements of the environment that are also holders of rights. So precisely this idea that was proposed in this planetary health law concept also by Eric Ip, we can see it in the court's reasoning here. But I think that is quite interesting to see that the court is really recognizing these complexities. A big innovation from a legal perspective, and this one I maybe need to explain a little bit in some detail, is that this court has said that the climate crisis and perhaps even the planetary health crisis is so existential, and it will have irreversible threats to vital ecosystems. It will disrupt the balance. So because it is so existential, and because all the other human rights that we will have depend on this planetary balance, the protection of the environment at the level to save the planet and to protect these planetary boundaries should be viewed as a so-called jus cogens obligation. And this is a legal term that signifies that this is really one of the highest norms of international law and it can never be violated. It's a norm that would sit even above human rights. And this is something that is now being studied because it's quite a unique statement to make. Because so far we have accepted only very few norms to be jus cogens. The prohibition on genocide, for example, the prohibition on slavery. So for the court to say that combating climate change in particular is of such importance that it is a jus cogens norm, it's really striking. We don't know as lawyers yet, and it is a very long judgment, 234 pages, what this will exactly mean, for example, for climate negotiations, right? Because what does it mean to say taking your climate obligation seriously is the highest norm? You can never violate them. You can never negate them for political reasons or whatever. But then what does that mean in legal practice? Finally, the court also realized or also said that states indeed possess a very wide range of legal obligations to address the climate crisis. Although we see, I think there the court's maybe struggling a little bit with imagining what those obligations would be, because the way it explains them so far, I think, is still somewhat in line with the more traditional environmental law standards that we have seen. both substantive rights, but also these procedural rights that I showed before with the Aarhus Convention, and that have also been later adopted in the Inter-American system through the Assoc agreement. So yes, this is a great start, but I think it also still requires us to think a little bit more boldly, and this is also something that I am personally interested in. And working together with non-lawyers might also push that boundary somewhat. At least that's what I would hope. One thing that I wanted to also highlight is that this use cogent argument might be quite new. This is really something that hasn't really been said before, but some other parts of the judgments are innovations at an international scale, but they are part of wider trends that are also happening in different parts of the world. So they're reflecting that. Specifically, the rights of nature movement is quite strong. Specifically, as you can see also indeed on the Inter-American continent. So it's not coming entirely out of nowhere. But yeah, a statement by a court like this is really going to push the boundary more widely. Then finally, that is my place to end on. What is next for the power of law in addressing planetary health? What might we anticipate from this new Inter-American opinion? What might be the ambitions of next opinions? One thing that we know for sure is that next week already we will receive the opinion by the International Court of Justice on climate change. It seems, I don't know if that is the case, that this court has waited for the Inter-American Court. Of course, there have been processes in parallel, so they will each have had their own processes. But the court's opinion was announced after the publication of the Inter-American one. If that is good news, because we hope that the Inter-American Court or the International Court will follow some of the regional courts' opinions, we will have to see. We know during the hearings that the courts in The Hague has been very interested in the right to healthy environment. It has been asking most people appearing in front of it, and most representatives in front of it, what do you think? Does this right exist? What is its content? What should we say about it? So I'm sure that the court will say something about the right to healthy environment. But will it also say things about rights of nature? We will have to see. Finally, last thing I want to say, also other regions are moving. Also in the African context and the African human rights system, an advisory opinion has been asked for on climate change. This court also tends to be bold, if not as bold as the Inter-American Court. But I'm sure it will surely be led by what other courts say in this area. So we have to see. I think the question for me as a legal scholar now is, and also for others working in this space, is what can we contribute to the debate, right? What might we offer in terms of legal innovations through the scholarship to try to say, hey, this is maybe something that is a viable way of legal development and that could be taken on board. So this is maybe also something that we can discuss. And I look forward to that. That was it.
Thank you very much. Let's give Marlies a big hand. So you close your presentation with anticipation, ambition.
Yes.
What's our aspiration for the future of planetary health? What's the role of law? And how can we work together, lawyers and non-lawyers alike? Before I open the floor and the virtual room for questions, maybe just to start off, what I'm hearing from you, and by the way, this presentation is fascinating. When I was choosing a course way back, after high school, I thought I'll pursue law. But then I ended up doing medicine, now in public health, now in planetary health, but now going back to law. So I have come back full circle. I probably will not do another law degree, but certainly I'll work with lots of lawyers like you, Marlies. And what I'm hearing from you is planetary health law. It's not just about environmental law plus health law equals planetary health law. I'm trying to be simplistic here, right? You also mentioned that, international environmental law, the treaties on pollution, on the ozone, the climate, treaty, for example, the Paris Agreement, they were constructed with the human being in mind, right? Yes. It's not really we're saving the planet for itself. It's still very anthropocentric. But what you're also saying is they're not enough to constitute what you're describing as planetary health law. So any thoughts? And I know the definition is still evolving. You have the IT definition, for example, which you highlighted the human obligations to conserve the health of the planet. So now it's like the planet is really the focus now.
Yes.
Is that the case, or is there a middle, ground there?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And you pointed out exactly the sticky issues. Is that much of the law that we still have today, whether it's global health law, whether it is indeed international environmental law, has this anthropocentric focus. If you look at most international environmental treaties, it is interesting because you will mostly see a similar phrasing that the objective of this environmental treaty is to protect human health and the environment. So often both is mentioned there, but I think when it comes down to it, it often comes down to this human interest, right? Environment as it is relevant or as it is encountered by humans. And what this planetary health perspective, I think, really tries to put forward is this more ecocentric perspective by really trying to understand not just our interactions with the environment that go both ways, but to maybe also see the intrinsic value of nature and protecting the planet for planet's sake. And like I said, the 3 recent treaties that I've shown, I think they all each in some way capture already a little bit of that. The pandemic treaty with really trying to highlight the human-animal environment interface through the One Health approach by trying to say we need to look at the drivers and we need to also prevent new pandemics from occurring. But again, there is still a trace of anthropocentric interest there. That's why are we tackling pandemics? It's mostly because humans are getting ill. And then the BBNJ treaty, the Oceans Treaty, is also quite interesting because it very explicitly refers to the intrinsic value of biodiversity. But again, then if we look at what that means, it's also not so clear, except that we're going to put large parts of the ocean under conservation areas, which means that if you take that to the most extreme version, it might be a nature reserve, so you really cannot touch it. If it's a lighter version, it might still be a conservation area where there can be sustainable use, right? So it's still about allowing reasonable human uses. So I think the current law that we have is insufficient. New treaties are inching forward, but are also still struggling. In some ways logical, because treaties are negotiated by humans. There's sometimes talk about what would it mean to put nature properly at the table with a voice. We see quite a few of these treaties being also negotiated with strong indigenous people's presence, who tend to bring this argument also forward much more. But I think that is it is a question for me how under a planetary health lens or paradigm we could push such new types of environmental legislation, but also case law.
Indeed. Still a work in progress.
Yes.
There's so much that needs to be done, and that requires a lot of collaboration. So my quick question to you is, because I think would you agree that you're an international lawyer, a health lawyer, and an environmental lawyer rolled into one?
Yes.
But do these at least three communities talk to one another? And I'm sure you have insider views on this.
Yes. And I will answer this because actually this is one of the things I've studied in the past as well. I'm also an international disaster lawyer.
Disaster law is another
area. So that's the other thing. Lawyers are very good at also innovating in these fields and thinking of new concepts that try to fit realities.
Right.
And I would hope that these communities would talk to each other more. Unfortunately, they don't always do that. We have in international law also our major societies and our conferences, and they all tend to have working groups on specific subtopics. But then the working groups, of course, ideally they would mix and they would meet. So it's difficult to get these conversations. As somebody who works in the different fields, I also sometimes feel myself I am in different communities, right. So I try to make the bridge. But I think on the pressure of these new type of court proceedings as well, where all these fields are mixing, you also see that the debates amongst the scholars are becoming more intertwined, if that makes sense, because we are all reflecting on similar types of court cases from different perspectives, and then trying to understand what happens with the law in that particular single case. So that works. But personally, I was quite impressed, and I think different communities did give an input to the pandemic treaty, for example, is that in the pandemic treaty, we do see the influence of all these laws, right? We see global health law, we see environmental health law concepts, we see the disaster law concepts,
Right.
prevention, protection, response.
Yeah. And you alluded to human rights law also.
Yes.
And we haven't even mentioned trade law, migration law. So there are many different spaces, which basically reflects the vastness of the planetary health, lens and field and space. So I'll open the floor, and I'm seeing questions online. We also have Rick ask questions when people registered online as well. But I also want to start first with a question from the room. So I don't know if we have someone who would like to ask the first question.
I have a question.
Yep.
There was a very influential decision made by the US Supreme Court and several federal courts going back more than 10 years, I think, giving corporations the same rights as individuals in terms of speech, ability to make political donations, etc. Has anybody considered applying the same principle to nature or particular environmental locations or causes or issues?
Yes, no, that is a very good observation, and I think in many areas of, especially also the human rights field, it has been considered somewhat of a poor development that corporations were given these types of similar rights, and we've seen that also in the European Convention on Human Rights, where even since the 1950s, businesses were given the same rights to property, for example, as human beings, where people have questions, well, what is the rationale of these rights, and specifically human rights? We shouldn't give them to non-humans, right? So that has been one part of the debate. So corporations shouldn't be there. But at the same time, we also actually do see that by giving other entities these rights, the door has opened also for nature. Although I do think that the rights of nature movement has not made so much use of the corporate rights precedent, let's say, because of course there's a danger in that most of the time rights of nature lawyers, they would not be a huge supporter of rights of corporations. But the idea that you can have different types of legal personality, that's not just humans who have legal personality, but also other entities, yes, that is where this development comes from. I hope that answers your question.
Just wanted to know if there was a movement in that direction, whether in one way or the other.
Yeah. The one thing that is also now being discussed for rights of nature, but similar to corporations, but for corporations it's somewhat easier, is if you say that these other entities also have rights and legal personality, is how do they exercise that, right? And there's also, again, other entities, because we're also talking about the rights of future generations, for example, as another one of these entities, as a rights holder, but who exercises it, right? Who speaks on behalf of nature?
They do not exist yet,
exactly.
Basically. Yeah. And actually, we have some questions being asked, when they registered regarding holding corporations account, right? So there's an interest. I mean, as you know, there's also this growing conversation around the commercial determinants of planetary health, right? Not only the fossil fuel industry, but also other types of corporations in various sectors, many of them transnational in scale and in presence. And international law, for example, correct me if I'm wrong, basically the target is nation states, right? But traditionally, maybe except for the International Criminal Court, which also now tries individuals. Our former president of the Philippines is now in The Hague, as some of you know, in prison. But should there be a similar mechanism for corporations, especially given the planetary health crisis that you highlighted? No?
That's an excellent point. So there is a lot of attention indeed to the responsibility of corporations for human rights in general, but also in the context of the climate crisis specifically. This area that I'm studying as well, climate change litigation, includes by now quite a few number of cases against corporations. We have had a very successful case, I would still say successful case in the Netherlands, a rights-based case against Shell, a major oil company, whereby NGOs have gone to court in the Netherlands and have said, based on international law and also the so-called UN guiding principles on business and human rights responsibilities are no longer just something that is relevant to states. Companies also have them. This is widely accepted. Shell also accepts this itself. It's on their website. They say that they commit to this. So then we need to see that also in their climate policy. So this Dutch case in the Dutch courts, it was accepted that yes, corporations have a separate human rights responsibility to tackle climate change. The case in appeal was dismissed because the court said, even if the corporation has this obligation at this moment, I cannot say in any definite legal manner how many reductions Shell as a company specifically has to make. So there was a more technical issue, but as a principle, the Dutch courts accept this. And also in recognition of this need to bring in businesses, the UN has been working on, I should have put it here actually, also a new treaty, which is the UN Business and Human Rights Treaty. So there is also legal innovation in that area, mostly in the human rights field.
Because before it was just a declaration, right?
Yeah.
Now they're turning it into a treaty, into something that has more teeth.
That is,
Which leads us to
power.
Which leads us to a question that keeps on recurring on Zoom, which is about the link between the international and the national, right?
Yes.
You have an international laws on various issues, and as we mentioned a while ago, nation states will need to be following them, right? Abiding by them. And if they do not, they should be held accountable for doing such. But for example, how do we ensure that these international or planetary health laws really get embedded or translated into the national? And then there's a comment here. What is the role of these treaties? It seems like there are no legal means, only the use of publicity, awareness, warning of health risks, etc. But can it be more than that, right?
Yeah, good questions. I hear two things indeed. First of all, what is the legal value of these treaties that I have been explaining? Is there any legal teeth and legal bite to it? The answer would be yes. From a legal perspective, all the instruments that I talked about, they have binding legal force. The challenge can sometimes be that for some of these environmental treaties, in the negotiation, the language of the binding treaty is not the strongest as we might have liked. So it can be sometimes also a bit promotional. But all of these treaties will also include shall, right? Clear things that states shall do. And if states shall do something, it is something that they must do. When states commit to this treaty, they must put in place a machinery, international legal system to implement this actual treaty. This translation process into national law, this is typically guided by a national parliamentary process or some type of national process in the states, of which we hope, of course, it functions well. We also know it doesn't always function well. That is, of course, the reality. And in that sense, I think that in this planetary health space, the human rights space, the environmental health space, there is also a major role for civil society, right? Checks and balances to making sure that civil society keeps track of and stays on top of whether or not these obligations are also implemented. Of course, I recognize in this sense that being an environmental human rights defender, for example, in some countries is extremely dangerous. It comes at great personal risk. If there is even space to exercise this type of pressure. But we see, I think, in a lot of countries around the world that everywhere there are people out there willing to risk, right? And I think that is extremely impressive. And it's also precisely what some of these other treaties try to protect. This Aarhus Convention on Procedural Rights, but also this Escazú Convention in the Latin American region. They really try to protect human rights defenders. So I think that part is indispensable. And when it comes to accountability, this is also where the past 5 years, maybe even 10 years, a lot of legal innovation has happened. Because what we have seen is that even if these international environmental agreements do not have a mechanism for accountability as such, and they might not be directly enforceable, people have been very creatively going to courts with their human rights, which they can actually invoke and hold states accountable for, and say, hey, but there is a link between my human rights and all these environmental matters, right? If you are not implementing all these environmental treaties well, my human rights get violated. And the courts in the American context even now said even it might be a jus cogens norm, right? So people have become creative in saying, I will ask accountability for the implementation of environmental treaties through my human rights, constitutional rights, international rights, whatever it is that I can claim. And they have done so with success, right? So I think this is a very powerful movement.
Great. Yeah. Since you already mentioned civil society, and I would like to think that the health sector or the health professionals are part, right, of civil society. What do you think is the special role of the health sector and of health professionals? How can we contribute? How can we work together between health folks and lawyers alike? I remember, I think it was early this year, Dr. Tedros, who was the Director General of the WHO, testified in the International Court of Justice, right? Emphasizing that the climate crisis is a global health crisis. Right. So what else can we do?
I think it's great. That's for pointing that out, because it's really one of the things that we are working on at the moment at our Groningen Center for Health Law as well. Is really this question of how can we collaborate and how can we strengthen these health arguments in climate change litigation, for example, by really trying to build stronger evidence, robust evidence, both at the public health level or global health level. But potentially also at individual level, because we also see that at individual level, for example, in Europe, there have been some cases of elderly women going to court with complaints of heat stress. But the European Court of Human Rights said, it's quite difficult for these women to prove the health effects on their personal health. But the court was willing to accept a lot of public health evidence on the impacts of climate change on elderly women in general. But in order to build that successfully and to explain to a human rights court what health impacts are, we need testimony, we need collaboration with public health professionals to try to really get that across to courts. And I think there is still a lot of space for improvement. And of course, when it comes to these more complex planetary health dimensions that we've talked about and planetary boundaries, we will need a different type of evidence.
Just a thought that crossed my mind. Maybe we can co-organize a joint school for planetary health that will bring together lawyers, policy folks, and then the health folks.
Let's do it.
Right? Let's do it.
And then one of our exercises at the end of the session to have a mock case.
Indeed, right.
To try to see how.
As if we're like, in the court, in the actual court, right? Giving us a lot of ideas, but also it will allow us to bridge, for example, Europe and Asia, which leads me to another question, because you mentioned some of the exciting cases happening in the Netherlands, or I think it was early this year also when Swiss mothers won, right? When they who did they sue? The government of Switzerland, or they sued the government of Switzerland. How about the global south, right? Are you seeing some exciting developments? What is the role of the global south? A lot of these international courts are based in the north, in the Netherlands, right? But how can we bring this planetary health law advocacy movement thinking in the global south?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, the one example I now gave was from indeed Europe or Dutch courts. But the other example that was on the presentation was, of course, very much in the inter-American system. And we have seen a lot of this legal innovation actually happening in the global south, not just in Latin America, but also we've seen very exciting cases in Asia. There are some very interesting cases that are being pioneered in Indonesia, also specifically by Greenpeace Indonesia, that really try to bring novel cases on health and climate change, also bringing in very much the dimension of the mental health impacts of climate change and the ecological grief and the climate anxiety that is being caused, especially amongst young people. And how can we capture those arguments in court? There have been very interesting examples in the Philippines, actually also when it comes to business and human rights and climate change. The National Human Rights Commission there has been involved in also really trying to clarify what are obligations of carbon majors. And what we see generally in this field of climate change litigation is a lot of cross-fertilization in all directions, right? Courts are citing each other's cases. They're drawing inspiration about what's happening. We'll now have to see also how are courts in Asia are going to react to what a court in Latin America has said, right? I think what is maybe our role also as planetary health lawyers or planetary health enthusiasts is to say, this is such a global issue. It should also be possible and logical to look at what a court in Latin America says or a court in Africa says, right? We are all dealing with the same planetary crisis. Legal systems might be slightly different, but we're all dealing with the same threat. So can we all be similarly bold and ambitious, right?
Indeed. So we have around 14 minutes remaining, and I wonder if we have more questions from those who are in the room or reflections. And maybe we can also spend this last segment to talk about, opportunities for the future. We already, just incubated a potential joint project.
Great.
And maybe while we're waiting, I know you're here not only in Singapore, but in Southeast Asia. Next week, we will be in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. You already mentioned some things happening as well there. Maybe you would like to share what are we going to do next week in Jogja?
Yes. So we're going together to Yogyakarta next week for a joint project with 2 Indonesian universities and also Stanford University, Indonesian University of Selepas Maret University, and Atmajaya. And we will work together also transdisciplinary with people from disaster practice, health, human rights, children's health, to try to develop together an indicator for monitoring the protection of the right to health for children in the context of climate disaster specifically. And the idea is that indeed also human rights bodies such as the National Human Rights Commission can hopefully or can be inspired to use these indicators when they are trying to assess how well governments are doing. And this, we will talk about it mostly in the Indonesian context, wider Asian context, but we of course hope to find also something that can be replicatable elsewhere. Yeah.
Great. So there are things that are happening, right?
Yes.
And more to come. And we look forward to more collaborators, right, from various areas of the planetary health community or space. Do we have any other questions, specific question? Please introduce yourself quickly.
Yeah, Marlies, as mentioned earlier, my name is Natasha. So I work with the policy core at the Global Health Institute, but I'm also doing a master's right now at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in Global Health Policy. I do have a course in Global Health Law next year, so I'm really keen to potentially include planetary health law as one of my interest areas there. But my question for you today, based on your presentation, was really about the concept of ecocide and whether or not you see it, or you could potentially see it being a concept that, as it implies the criminalization of environmental destruction, and might it have adverse impacts on certain populations more than others? And I ask this question because in many places in Asia, a large majority of environmental destruction is not necessarily done by corporations. And so I just wonder if this concept of ecocide evolves, like would it end up affecting, populations that perhaps are of lower socioeconomic status and of more vulnerable status, then actually impacting, larger entities that are able to respond to, these principles of like rights of nature, etc. So I'd love to know your thoughts.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And when you say it will disproportionately these other actors, it's because you fear that these other actors might be held accountable in that case?
Yeah, because
for example, in the agricultural sector.
Yes, exactly. Agricultural sector is also in like marine, fishing villages where there's a huge reliance on fishing practices, but there are more destructive practices like fish trawling, for example. I was just on a diving trip last week in East Malaysia, and there was we could hear fish bombing from kilometers away from our dive site. So it was, and I was very confused because it was like a bomb, explosion sound in the water, and I was like, what is this? So I spoke to the dive instructors after that, and they told me that it's fish bombing.
Yeah.
Right, and even though it's an illegal practice in East Malaysia, it still happens on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
So the concept of ecocide was first time I heard about it today, and
great.
I immediately linked that back to a potential real life case scenario.
Yes. Yeah, that's a very good point. So maybe two things. So first of all, indeed, this idea of ecocide as it's being proposed now, and you can tell already a bit, it sounds a bit similar to genocide, is that it's really the idea that this concept will be included, for example, in the International Criminal Court in The Hague, whereby the idea is that the type of crime that's being committed is really of a large scale, widespread ecological destruction, which is indeed the main critique. It's a very high threshold to be put in jail in The Hague for violating this crime. So that's maybe a first caveat. Let's say it would be about such structural, large-scale environmental disaster that it would be unlikely, in my view, that ordinary persons, let's say, would ever be held responsible for this. It's more likely that it will be state perpetrated. There is, of course, a lot of talk about the large-scale environmental destruction during times of war, which would also fit the criminal court quite well. But again, that is also an important limitation because there's also a lot of environmental destruction outside of war. So the concept of ecocide, I think, again, is this very good way of trying to reconceptualize and to push the boundaries somewhat. But we also will need still novel thinking about how people can then actually be held responsible. Because these larger scale environmental impacts, it is likely that they will be also maybe a combination of a lot of people doing different things. So how can you hold each of these individual persons responsible for contributing to the big environmental harm, climate change, for example? So I think the concept is there, but then to apply it to these more abstract, large scale planetary health types of degradation, I think we also still need a bit of innovation.
Right.
The benefit of it might be that ordinary people is unlikely to be affected as such.
Great. We have another question?
Building on that question, because from the presentation just now, and then we discussed and talked about the international treaties and then how national law and international law should be enforced. But then now thinking back, right, these treaties, I think to me it seems more like targeting from a more macro level perspective. But then, so my building to that question is there how far are we on the progress, or do we even have any laws that are looking more from a micro perspective? The reason why I'm asking this is because, right now in our society, we have the law that states that, do not steal. If you steal, then you'll get imprisoned, you see. So because of that, and then I don't steal, because it's targeting me at a micro level. If not, I think, I'll be, but anyway, so, but looking from the idea of planetary health, and then, unfortunately, there is a tragedy of the of the commons, if I don't, because when I pack food, I use my container, but then I see the person in front of me use the disposable, and I'm like, what should I do with this? It's okay, I just, so, so we don't have this, specifically. So what was your thought on this?
Yeah, no, I get this point. So I think, the benefit and the limitation of international law is that it tries to regulate problems at this macro level. It's about recognizing that something is an international issue and requires international cooperation of some sort. But we do see for quite a few environmental treaties, for example, the trade in hazardous waste or the protection of endangered species, that states are also obligated to put national criminal sanctions on illegal conduct. So in that sense, international law can sometimes also work to say, well, if you steal, you shouldn't be doing that, and if you do, you go to prison. So international law requires that of national states. But then the challenge is that it's dependent on the willingness of the state, not just to put that in law, but the willingness and ability to be able to monitor that well, because it's also a costly thing. It's not, and it's always with law. Whenever there is law, it is also always broken. To some extent, right? And then it is also in some way part of a sociological norm where we also do try to reinforce it together, right? So it's an excellent question that requires both a legal answer, but also maybe in some ways an interdisciplinary answer, because also is at one point the way that you create it is about sociology, right? What makes us follow the law.
We have more questions.
I
Very
think I
quickly.
have a question. Yeah, my name is Arpita. As I introduced, I'm working in policy core at the Global Institute. So I think my question is more from the policy side of things. When you have like opposition towards the laws and treaties that you mentioned, and you have this political tension sometimes, and arguments, debates on this. How do you think you deal with that kind of scenario, and what do you think is the best way to approach situations where you feel that there's that political pressure, or you feel certain things have that kind of risk or cost to it?
Mhm. You mean there's resistance at the national level
Yes.
by people, by the government, or by
Politicians.
Just
politicians?
anybody who's at that power stage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is of course something that we very clearly see in the UN climate negotiations, but we probably see it in every type of environmental negotiations. I think the first plain answer would be is that of course every state does have different realities, environmental realities, developmental realities, poverty realities.
Yeah.
So they will go into these negotiations understandably, I think, with different types of expectations. So they might resist to certain type of negotiations or standpoints or obligations more strongly. But what I would hope, and what I think is a contribution of this planetary health paradigm as well, is to really try to convey this message. We are in the same boat, right? We are in it together.
Yeah.
Planetary health boundaries are, there's a crisis, they're being transgressed. So it does require an effort. And that doesn't mean that the effort still needs to be the same for all countries. It might be still differentiated, like it is in the Paris Climate Change Agreement. But I think there is an important message of trying to say, every state needs to probably do something at this point, right? And can the negotiations really be based on this shared interests as much as it is in on individual interests? But I think it's a question of messaging.
And awareness as well.
Yeah, and we do have legal concepts to capture this, right? So we have the concept of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities in climate law to precisely capture this. And it's a bit fuzzy, it's a bit meant to be. But you can fill that responsibility in ambitiously, or you can fill it in as a race to the bottom, right? So
So interesting from those, final remarks that you said. One thought that crossed my mind is that maybe one unique contribution of planetary health thinking vis-a-vis law is that we're now going beyond the usual spatial and temporal boundaries of the law, right? Like usually when there's a law, we're holding people, corporations to account for affecting a specific population who are affected now, right? Now we're thinking about the planetary effects on people who will not vote on that legislation or for those politicians, but are nonetheless affected, but also temporally, even the future, right? Even those who are yet to be born. You mentioned the phrase future generation. So I think that's also kind of a legal innovation. But in terms of how it will succeed, I think it's yet to be seen, but that means we need to work more together, right? We need more transdisciplinary collaboration as well. Wow. That's an hour-long crash course on the law. And if I ask for a show of hands, who now wants to do more legal education, right? Or to at least be part of these transdisciplinary exchanges, right? And also co-creation of solutions, right? We may do the medical solutions, we need the legal solutions, we need the policy solutions. One word that has not been mentioned yet, which is also very intertwined with international law, is diplomacy.
Yes.
And our previous episode actually looked into diplomacy for planetary health. So at the end of the day, they're all interconnected, and we just need to be open to working with people who use a different language, but nonetheless complement, what we do in health. So thank you, of course, Marlies, for gracing us today. And I'm sure this is not the last engagement. We're just beginning. And of course, thanks to our participants, both in person and online. See you next time in our next episode of Conversations in Planetary Health. Take care.
Thank you, Reza.
Thank you.